Genetics Section 4, Beyond Mendelian Heredity. You guys are all going to start out with a Bellringer. When you're done with the Bellringer, we will go on and we will look at the key ideas for this section. The outline for this unit includes many genes, many alleles, genes affected by the environment, genes linked within chromosomes, and then we'll summarize. So your Bellringer, the two pictures here are of the same species. We have a Arctic fox in the summer and in the winter, and so your Bellringer lists the possible mechanisms that allow the Arctic fox to change its fur color with the changing seasons. So what is it that might cause this organism to be able to change its coat color dependent upon the changes in the seasons? Key ideas for this section. Are there any exceptions to the simple Mendelian patterns of inheritance? So we've talked quite a bit about just simple monohybrid crosses or dihybrid crosses with some of the simple things that Mendel observed in his experiments. So the question is, are there any exceptions to his rules that he came up with? And then, how do heredity and the environment interact to influence phenotype? Remember, phenotype is the physical trait that is expressed. Don't confuse that with genotype. And then, how do linked genes affect chromosome assortment and crossover during meiosis? And then remember, meiosis is that time where your sex cells are produced, where those cells are split, and we end up with half the number of chromosomes. So meiosis is that stage where we end up producing the sperm cells and the egg cells. Many genes, many alleles. It's really important for us to realize that Mendel's laws are much more complex than what he really identified. In nature, Mendel's inheritance patterns they don't happen very often. There's a number of other things that control how genes are passed on from parent to offspring, and then beyond how they're passed on from parent to offspring, also how your body actually expresses those given traits. And a number of those different patterns of inheritance include polygenetic inheritance, incomplete dominance, multiple alleles, and codominance. A character that is influenced or affected by more than one gene is called a polygenetic character. So a number of examples that are polygenetic characters include eye color, height, and skin color. And it's important for us to realize that most characters are polygenetic. Okay, so most of the traits that you express, most of your physical attributes are not due to just one or two simple genes. There's usually more than one gene that codes for the traits that you have. Genes that have 3 or more possible alleles are said to have multiple alleles. One example of that is ABO blood groups, and we'll look at that on the next slide. And you may or may not know your blood type, but your blood type is dependent upon not just 2 alleles, but it's actually dependent upon 3 alleles. Codominance is another example, and it's a condition in which both alleles for the same gene are fully expressed. So one is not dominant over the other. If you get a recessive allele and you also get what we'd maybe consider a dominant allele, both of them end up expressed. And then the genetics of human blood groups is an example of codominance. So this picture shows the blood phenotypes, and as was mentioned earlier, this is an example of multiple alleles controlling blood groups. And there's a number of different combinations that you can end up with. We'll notice up here, if we say that this individual up here is possibly mom, this one over here could possibly be dad, depending on how we look at this chart. The 3 possibilities that we have are type A, type AB, type B, and then if you don't have either of the alleles for that, you end up with type O. So there's actually 4 possibilities for your blood type. If you get the blood type molecules from mom and dad that are type A, you end up type A. If you get a type A from mom and a type B from dad, or vice versa, you end up type AB. If you end up where maybe you end up getting a type O from one parent, but then you also get either type A or type B from mom or dad, then dependent upon what you get, type A or type B would be your blood type. So if mom gave you an O and dad gave you an A, you'd be type A. If mom gave you an O and dad gave you a type B, you'd be type B. And then finally, if you get the type O blood type, you would have to have gotten alleles that code for type O from mom and from dad.
For many traits, one allele completely masks the other allele. For example, a rabbit with a black allele and a brown allele for coat color will be black. This relationship is called complete dominance.
And this example is an example of what we've been talking about over the past. This is an example where anytime the dominant allele is present, that trait is expressed. And it's important to remember that this does not happen all that often in nature.
For some traits, the dominant allele only partially masks the recessive allele. For example, breeding red snapdragons with white snapdragons produces pink snapdragons. This relationship is called incomplete dominance.
There are a number of things in nature that exhibit incomplete dominance. Basically what happens is there's kind of a mixing of the two traits that are inherited. So if you ended up with snapdragons, for example, if you end up with red, one red parent and one white flowered parent, then the mixing causes an intermediate form. And in this case, it would be pink flowers.
For some traits, both alleles are displayed. For example, breeding a red horse with a white horse produces horses with a coat color called roan. The coat of a roan horse contains equal numbers of red hairs and white hairs.
All right, so codominance is an example where there is not a dominant or recessive one. Basically what ends up happening is the offspring end up with a mixed characteristic where there's a number of white hairs that grow, and there's also a number of red hairs or darker colored hairs that grow, and then they just kind of mix in together. Genes affected by the environment. Phenotypes can be affected by things that happen within our environment. It could be nutrients and whether nutrients are available. It could be temperature. Some organisms are controlled by the amount of light and the duration of light throughout the seasons. And so there's a number of environmental factors that can also impact the phenotype that is expressed within an organism. So looking back at that Bellringer and thinking about the Arctic fox, there's obviously an environmental factor that causes them to change their coat color. In humans, there's many characters that are partially determined by heredity, such as height, and those things can also be affected by the environment. For example, if you have malnutrition, you don't get the correct nutrition in your daily diet, the possibility of you getting the height that your genes is coding for is severely diminished. Many aspects of human personality and behavior are also affected by the environment, but also genes play an important role into our personality and our behavior. Genes linked within chromosomes. Mendel studied some very basic and simple kinds of heredity. Characters are determined by independent genes. And he observed that over and over and over again inside of his experiments. During meiosis, genes that are close together on the same chromosome are less likely to be separated than genes that are far apart. This event called crossing over can occur, where genes basically get flip-flopped and switched on the chromosome. Mendel didn't really observe that. Genes that are close together as well as the traits that they determine are said to be linked. So if you had a very short section of a gene where two genes are real close to one another, or a short section of a chromosome where two genes are one right on top of another, those two genes are said to be linked. The possibility of those genes separating is pretty minimal. So linked genes tend to be inherited together. When two genes are very close to one another, the chances of those genes being separate when meiosis occurs and being separated during meiosis is pretty minimal. So in summary, the Mendelian inheritance pattern is rare in nature. Other patterns include polygenetic inheritance, incomplete dominance, multiple alleles, and codominance. Phenotype can be affected by conditions in the environment, such as nutrients and temperature. And then during meiosis, genes that are close together on the same chromosome are less likely to be separated than genes that are far apart.